Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in today's panel webinar, Return to Work and Inclusive Design, COVID-19 and Beyond. My name is Jutta Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We would like to thank our academic team and our 9 founding partner organizations in the Harnessing Talent project. Harnessing Talent Alliance for Recruiting and Retaining Canadians with Disabilities and Mental Health Challenges is a 3-year project funded by Employment and Social Development Canada. This webinar is made possible through the support of ESDC as well as memberships to WWI. We thank our advisory committee and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. To members, WWI, VRA Canada, or CPHR Alberta members, a reminder that you receive free certificates of attendance. Today, we're extremely happy to welcome our panelists, Jutta Treviranus and Jess Mitchell. Jutta Treviranus is the director of the Inclusive Design Research Center and professor in the Faculty of Design at the OCAD University in Toronto. And Jess Mitchell is the senior manager of Research and Design at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University in Toronto. Without further ado, Jutta, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to talk about this topic. So our topic is Return to Work and Inclusive Design, COVID-19 and Beyond. And as was mentioned, there's 2 of us, and I'm going to cover we often use the analogy of the head, heart, and hands for any of you who have participated in either 4-H or Girl Guide activities. And I'm going to talk or take care of the head part, so tell you about things to think about. And Jess is going to then follow up with the very essential and necessary, how do you feel about this and how do you apply it in your own life? And we're hoping that that will then lead to the hands part, because we'll provide a number of resources that you can use to explore how you can implement some of the things we're talking about. So part of the title was COVID-19, and we see COVID-19 as having somewhat of a silver lining in addition to all of the inequitable impacts that have happened, because it is a disruptive opportunity. And in looking at it from the optimistic side, we checked out what many of the words associated with the pandemic actually mean. What is the origin, the epistemology of these words? And not surprisingly, crisis means crossroads or decisive point, but emergency even has a positive origin, emergence, or to emerge, arise, and bring to light. And catastrophe actually comes from sudden overturning. Many of these terms are associated with a dissolving of the status quo, leaving normal, in suspension, lack of predictability, state of flux. And as we've probably experienced, all of us who have had to transition, is what emerges is an understanding of what really matters, what is really possible, what is required of us, and the value of life and what makes a life worth living. It's an overturning of what and who is valued, the conventions that we follow, and the assumptions and presumptions that we have. We reach a turning point, a window of opportunity, where there's a conflict between returning to the status quo and making profound changes. We pursue change and adapt to change in ways that seemed impossible. Think about the working from home. And what arises are some of the worst and best possibilities of what our world might look like afterwards. And often, not just in this crisis, but in previous crises where we have this disruption, there's a tension between awareness that we're all connected, to consider all the consequences of our decisions, because our decisions become even more impactful, and the types of love and actions that people have taken to support the community as a whole, and especially people that are most vulnerable. And on the other side, we also see the worst, which is the assumption that freedom means no limit to self-interest, that people can pick and choose values, facts, and rules all of a sudden, and that this is an opportunity for a power grab. So at a very fundamental level, what we're doing at the moment is balancing also between this idea of, or the need for human difference and variability and the conditions for belonging. And we're redefining those and rethinking those and balancing them with a desire for commonality, familiarity, simplicity, efficiency, and speed. And of course, as I alluded to, we put into question what has value, how we know what is true, who participates in decisions, who we design things for, and sorry, who benefits our society. And what I'm talking about here is beyond the obvious types of changes that have come about. We all already assume that moving forward, work from home will be a viable option. It's going to be an opportunity within every workplace. We know that we're going to have to reduce high-touch areas. And of course, there's some very practical implications for someone with a disability. Those doorways will need to be largely automatic or in some way easier to open. People will be compelled to stay at home when sick. There won't be an option of encouraging people to continue working or to continue to come in. So that means we're going to have to support people when they are sick better and allow greater options in terms of staying at home when you're sick and recovering when you're sick. And I think even the layout of offices will change. We will likely see a shift away from open offices. But from an inclusive design perspective, there is a chance for a much deeper reform. One of the things that we do in inclusive design is we engage in what we call the toddler grandparent conversation. So any of you who have a toddler in your family or have experienced a toddler know that they continuously ask, but why? But why? A iterative, repetitive, whatever answer you give, they ask why. And this is actually a great way of looking at why we have done things, what are our assumptions and presumptions to date, and to start to question those things that where we say, oh, that's just the way it is, or assume that things are unchangeable. We can look at our current situation globally as a very rugged terrain in flux, and this is part of complexity theory. And from a complexity theory perspective, we're stuck on a local optima, and we continue to hill climb because we're optimizing to continue to move up that local optima. Our advancing, our progress, our optimization, our productivity, our progress all push us up this local hill. But in fact, the only way we're going to get out of the crisis is to find what we call the global optima. That is somewhere else, but we don't quite know as yet. And the unfortunate thing as well is we're not looking for that global optima. We are still trying to go up the local optima, and we're eroding the slope, so it makes it harder and harder for people at the bottom to get up. And what we need to do is to find that global optima. And one of the things that we know from complex adaptive theory is that the people closest to the bottom are much more diverse. They're less invested in the past, and they collectively see more of the terrain. So they're the ones that are going to be our guides to the global optima. The only formula to to reach the global optima is diversity and collaboration, diversification and difference, to include diverse perspectives, so to stop doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results, and to work together or collaborate. And if we look at that local hill from above, the current hill, we see, or we can actually plot it as a human starburst, where, and this is one of the exercises that I go through when I'm looking at data, because we've collected over the many years that we've had the Inclusive Design Research Center requirements from a number of different populations. And the only way to plot it is to plot it on a multivariate scatter plot. And what you see then is that 80% of the requirements are up at, or are in the middle of the human starburst, taking up about 20% of the space. And the remaining 20% of the requirements are distributed across the rest, or the periphery of that human starburst. And the dots in the middle are very close together, meaning they're very similar. The dots at the edges are very far apart, meaning they're very different. And as a result of this, and as a result of how we've chosen to design work or learning or products, environments, design works for all of the requirements in the middle is difficult to use as you move away from the middle, and people that are at the periphery can't use the design. And if we are looking at predictions or research, it's highly accurate for the middle, it's inaccurate as you move away from the middle, and it's wrong as you reach the periphery. And as a result, we've made the entire ecosystem that we have, whether it's work, whether it's learning, whether it's research, whether it's democracy, difficult for those individuals at the edge. If you, and that outer edge is largely, people with disabilities occupy that outer edge, as do other people that experience barriers or are in some way different from the norm. If we think about disability, the only common data element of disability is sufficient difference from the norm that things don't work for you. And this observation and this phenomena ripples through every part of our life, whether it's design or products, especially digital products, which are increasing in availability, reliability, functionality, and cost for anyone in the middle, but the opposite is happening at the edge. Knowledge and truth, research. We are, because of the requirement regarding statistical significance and the way that we favor specific research methods, we know a lot about that group in the middle, but the group at the outer edge is ignored, not recognized, and not understood. Education is also attempting to rank and create conformance and is very competitive, excluding those individuals out at the outer edge. And I'll talk a lot more about this particular phenomenon within work. But even democracy, where if it's reduced to simply one person, one vote and majority rules, democracy also, of course, is biased against those individuals out at the outer edge. And this has negative effects for those individuals, but also for everyone within our community, because we are encouraged to treat humans as a mass and assume that humans are homogeneous. And one thing we should note is at any time when you least expect it, with the greatest probability, everybody will end up out at that outer edge. And that's one of the things we've seen within the pandemic. All of us who seemed to be far from or not needing to be concerned about some of these discriminations are all of a sudden having to deal with it. The other thing to note is that out at that outer edge, we find innovation and weak signals, the risks to come. We missed the weak signal of COVID-19 or found it much later than we should have. And we have been treating the advice that we've given to people within the pandemic as though everybody has a place to shelter, everybody has access to washing hands, everybody can participate in work and has the digital wherewithal to participate. We've always been assuming and giving the advice and guidance only for that middle. So what are the implications of this for work? The much more profound thinking that it would be great to, and the more profound reflection on the implications of COVID-19 as a disruptive moment to think about how do we want to consider work? How do we want to change work? And here I'm going to go to an analysis of work within a spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, we have work as an engineered machine, and this is how most of work is being considered at the moment. And at the other edge, we have work as an organic organism, or any enterprise that involves work as an organic organism. Work as an engineered machine views workers as replaceable parts of a machine. It requires conformance in terms of timing, production. It requires micromanagement, and it requires a segregated set of steps that are in lock with each other. This type of view of work also requires a hierarchy of control and oversight. Work as an organic organism, however, is at the opposite end of the spectrum. There's a common compass, a vision or mission, but no prescriptive path. There's an opportunity for everyone within the organism to be creative, to innovate, and it's dependent on teamwork and complementarity and a flexibility of roles where everyone understands what the mission is and can step in to do whatever is necessary. And this is similar to Ursula Franklin's insights regarding technology. Ursula Franklin defined technology as as involving organization, procedures, symbols, new words, equations, and most of all, a mindset. And she similarly characterized work as at two ends of a spectrum: holistic work and holistic technologies, because of course technology from her perspective encompasses all of the parts of work, and prescriptive technologies or work, where holistic work meant that the individuals that were part of the work had control over their own work from start to finish and were participating in the entire planning and achievement of a particular goal or vision, as were prescriptive work broke down work into a sequence of steps which required supervision, which discouraged critical thinking and required a culture of compliance. And even more recent individuals who contemplate work, such as Seth Godin, have looked at this spectrum, where he talks about leaders versus managers. Where managers need authority, leaders take responsibility. Managers tell people what to do and expect them to do it, and leaders inspire people. And so with these two ends of the spectrum, there are implications regarding adaptability and responsiveness. Engineered work it's very hard to change or respond to change, because if any one piece within that the machine is broken or changes its performance, then the entire machine grinds to a halt. And in order to make any change, you would need to re-engineer every piece within the machine. However, organic organisms or organic forms of work, they naturally respond to change. It's very easy to shift and to be creative and resourceful and innovative. So what does this have to do with inclusion? Inclusion is about choices. It's about options and flexibility for workers. When you're in an engineered work environment, there are very hard constraints. You need to have a very, very specific formula for each cog within the wheel. If you are in an organic work environment thrives on diversity and choices and on diverse perspectives. And the other thing to note is that work is changing, and we have not only robotics, but AI automation, automated decision system coming down the pipe and very much already integrated into our work. And if we think about what is the future for workers within this vision of the future of work, we have to recognize that anything formulaic can be accomplished by machines. Engineered work can be replaced by machines. And to some extent, many of the companies that are looking at the future of work have already realized that. And they are using models like the Uber model, where the current human drivers are used as data systems to teach the automated workers who will take their place. And many of the work surveillance systems are collecting data on how people perform and what is the optimal performance, such that that data can be fed to robots. So we have to think about, what are we setting up our workers for? What are we setting up our learners for? And human resources definitely needs to change, because our entire job description, hiring process, and especially ones that are using artificial intelligence to assist, are about hiring replaceable workers that each can fill a very prescribed job description, assessing based on past optimum, rewarding conformance, training to conform to a particular formula, and assumptions about the time required to perform a particular task. And of course, this brings in AI and work, and I won't go too much in this, but certainly the AI systems, the automated decision systems we're implementing and that are quite prevalent already in our work systems are discriminating against individuals with disabilities or people out at that outer edge. Whether it's the hiring systems that choose who to interview amongst a large set of candidates, whether it's the, and of course, one of the things we've determined is that the bias audits, which are supposed to remove the bias from those systems, don't work for disability, because disability, as I mentioned, is not a constrained data group. And so systems that compare performance of the model with the default versus a particular protected identity group don't catch the bias against disability. Instructional tutors encourage people to conform to a particular formula. Assessment and promotion that uses data gathered from work surveillance will be biased against anyone that is anomalous or doesn't do things in the formulaic way. And when that is used to terminate someone, because AI is often not explainable, you won't have any recourse when you are terminated. And similarly, even our work equity and DEI efforts seem to be implementing a faux equity. We assume that inviting people into a work environment and thereby being representative in terms of the people that we're inviting if you're someone that's never been within that work environment and didn't help to shape the work environment, it is to some extent a setup for failure. Quite frequently, people with disabilities are brought into a work environment where there are so many frictions and barriers within the work that it becomes very difficult to perform the job. And so eventually that degrades performance despite all of the efforts of the employee, and it sets them up to be terminated. Many of the ways in which we're addressing social justice are asking us to categorize, label, and put people into boxes and address the needs of that particular box, but that doesn't address the needs of people that fall through the cracks or are stranded at the edges. And one of the other things we're rethinking right now, of course, is gig work, because that promised us full flexibility and adaptability to the worker. But in fact, what happened was work surveillance was used to guide those workers into a conformant pattern, and using Skinnerian and behaviorist tactics of reward and punishment to ensure that workers were still homogeneous and replaceable. One of the things we're looking at is an alternative to this, where we are looking at platform co-ops, which allow workers to own and govern their own platform. So what we need to do is to address our difficulty with diversity, nonconformance, dissonance, messiness and uncertainty, complexity, and deviation from the norm. We call this the wabi-sabi approach to designing for work, recognizing the importance and the value within the impermanent, imperfect, and incomplete. And this also allows us to adapt and find that global optima that will guide us out of our crisis. We also need to adapt nonlinear logic models. We very much think that we can predict the future and we can construct a set of steps towards the desired future. But the future is changing, it's unexpected. The things that are most disruptive are the things that we can't predict. And this doesn't mean the design thinking squiggle where we iteratively move towards one winning solution. We have to recognize that there is no one winning way to do things. What we are encouraging with inclusive design is the alternative, which is a virtuous tornado. So rather than iterating to a one winning design or solution, what we look at is continuously asking who's missing, what are we not thinking about, and iterating out to include more and more. And one of the objections, of course, especially within an economic crisis which accompanies a pandemic, is, well, what about cost? Isn't this going to cost a lot more? But what we've actually seen is that if you plan not just for that middle, but if you plan out, right out to the edge, with the edge, the individuals that are at that edge, then you reduce the cost in the medium and long term. If you only plan with the center, then it's going to become very brittle because there will be more and more things you haven't thought about and you won't be able to adapt. And so whatever design you have or whatever plan you have for your service or your place of work will reach end of life much more quickly, as where a design that plans with the edge will be able to adapt and will be able to change. And we've recognized that when we value the vulnerable edge of our human scatter plot, we can adapt to change and respond to the unexpected. We are better at detecting risk. We respond to inevitable change and transfer of context. It results in greater dynamic resilience and longevity, and it will hopefully reduce the disparity that we're currently feeling and may hold thereby the key to our survival. And now I'm going to turn it over to Jess.
Can you all see the slide okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. So what do we do with all of this? I want to take the approach that what we're dealing with is an ethical issue, and it always has been. It's just been magnified and made more urgent presently. And we can see it a bit better from the perspective that we have. We still see racism, sexism, ableism. We still see the complexities, the haves and the have-nots, the intersectionality, what works and what doesn't. And this has just been magnified in this time. And as you just said, we're not so good at predicting what happens in the world. It is unpredictable, it is dynamic, it's emerging and adapting, and we're constantly adapting to it. And these are just a couple of examples of some of those things. So you've got obviously COVID-19, you've got the Texas snowstorm, the Dust Bowl, which was a human created, you could argue that all of these are human created disasters, and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And we've got more and more and more examples of those historically that can point to our failures of what I think are not just predicting and speculating, but failures of imagination, of prediction, of speculation, but also of righteousness, of justice, and of ethics. Failures that come down to our methods, our structure, the context, and more. What Jutta mentioned is very much what we are experiencing now, which is an opportunity. So many of us within this pandemic have had to answer the question for ourselves, and our communities have had to answer the question, what is essential? We've realized that there are people who have families that need their care and that they need to be home to care for their families during this pandemic, which has an impact on work. We've realized that not everyone has high-speed internet and a computer. And we've realized that giving someone a mask to wear still does not solve some of their basic human needs like shelter, food, and clean water. And again, those are things that we saw beforehand but have been magnified now. There are a lot of other things that we've realized, that teachers are kind of amazing and really essential people in our lives. We've realized that 6-year-olds really don't understand the QWERTY keyboard, and it makes no sense to them. And we've realized that sitting in a restaurant is a luxury. I hope that we've realized that the most who are at risk are the ones who started below zero before this pandemic and are now at further risk. We realize things like the big box stores are fundamentally different from the small corner stores, and what they give to communities is quite different. It's shifted our perspective, and hopefully we're seeing things differently. But we're at the risk of losing that too, unfortunately. I bristle every time I hear someone talk about how eager they are to get everything back to normal. Because in normal, I don't think asked this question enough: what is fair? Our normal is rife with inequalities. The social, economic, professional disparities. We see all the new ways we can oppress through the lens of COVID-19. Who is essential? Who can call in sick to work or work from home? And who can protect their children from risk? And the health disparities. We've got healthcare workers grappling with this now. And these are deep ethical issues. Who should get vaccinated first? How do we decide who gets a ventilator? This moment is an opportunity. There was just an article yesterday in the New York Times called "Welcome to the YOLO Economy, You Only Live Once." And here's a quote from Jonathan Nightingale saying that employees have a totally unprecedented ability to negotiate in the next 18 to 48 months. If I, as an individual, am dissatisfied with the current state of my employment, I have so many more options than I used to have. What we've seen is people burning out. We've seen people saying, You know, my company says everybody's going to be back in the office in June. I'm going to quit before June. I don't want to work that way again. I don't want that kind of work-life balance. And I know that I can find another place to work where people are more tuned into that. And the question then, I think, becomes, if you're not rethinking how we can go back to work, or whatever that means, how we can continue work, why not? So what we saw during this pandemic is all of those things that companies absolutely couldn't do before COVID, they actually pivoted to do and have been doing for over a year. We had large, complex companies and governments and systems who could not work from home, working from home overnight, arranging for captions on all of their phone calls or video conference calls, making alternative formats to cover different area codes, creating flexible work times because they realized that some of their employees were caring for seniors in their home or had children that weren't going to daycare or to schools. We saw people opening up conferences, and instead of 30 of the usual suspects showing up to your talk, you had hundreds from all over the globe. We saw events opening up, teaching changed. Suddenly, people were talking about a pedagogy of care. So what does it look like to care for students during this time? Classes are recorded, created audio files, we had transcripts, we had captions, we had extensions, we had universities and systems encouraging that we be looser on things like grammar. This is a moment where we didn't ask people to demand a kind of a level of quality of things that were not essential, but rather to demand that we work to bridge the digital divide. The digital divide getting wider for some. Again, the haves and the have-nots. Students who didn't have access to high-speed internet going to outside local libraries to pick up the internet. Students who didn't have access to technologies, being completely dependent upon school systems to provide them with those technologies. And it gets us back to that difference between equality and equity. And this is pre-pandemic and during and post. My colleague in the open education movement, Mahabali, says, this is a nice picture, and what it shows is that to reach the apple, some people need a higher platform or different accommodations. But she points out, what if you don't need an apple? What if what you need is an orange? Or what if it isn't a fruit that you need at all, but you need someone to be compassionate, or you need someone to care about what's going on with you? And this is, I think, where that big opportunity comes in for us. So the way that I like to think about it is, do you make any decisions in your professional role? And we all do. And so if you make decisions and they have an impact on another person, then you are a designer. And your designs have an impact on those people. You are declaring this thing and not anything else when you make those decisions. You might have reasons, and they might range from that's the way we always do it, as Jutta mentioned, to something more horrendous, like because I said so, or because research shows it's good for the majority, or most people operate this way. If you make decisions that affect another, you're designing, and your decisions are not neutral. We make these decisions all the time. And I would argue that most of our modern problems that we're confronting are ethical problems. So in the time of COVID, who gets a respirator? Who gets aid? Who's protected? Who's the protector? Who's the safer bet, right? And from the business perspective, I think the concept that's often called the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit comes into view. So who is making the difficult choices? Here we've got the Premier of Ontario saying that those difficult choices fall on him. And this is a decision that was announced on Friday. It shows the captions, the sign language interpretation. Then there was a flood of Twitter comments because he had made some decisions about playgrounds. A lot of people with access to technology and with a lot of privilege and the ability to shout back on Twitter objected to the closing of playgrounds, because it is also the fact that the children are not in school. So then it becomes, well, how do I get any work done? What do I do? He retracted the limitation on playgrounds, and some people, I think, quite rightly said, you know, just as you have this great lobbying power, you people in privilege, how about you also put a lot of pressure on him to do something like give those people who are essential workers paid time, or help people who are more at risk get vaccinations. So this comes down to the ethical decisions that he has to make on behalf of the province. So what's the failure rate that he will tolerate? Any politician has to make this. So who is accountable? Who's responsible? Where does the buck stop? And what is your moral responsibility? And I think that what I'm saying here is that that's all of us. Anybody in a leadership position who's making a decision that impacts another and is therefore a designer has a responsibility to do that. And this is a tweet from Val Afshar, the chief digital evangelist from Salesforce, and it says, "You're personally responsible for becoming more ethical in the society you grew up in." So I think that the responsibility is all of ours. You get a nice quote here from John Kerry: "The people who can benefit the most from good design often have the least access to it." And this part, I think, is quite important. Dignity is to design what justice is to law and health is to medicine. And I think that the point that I'd like to make here is that all of those are practices. They are not ends in and of themselves. We practice law, we practice medicine, and we practice design. In that practice, our hope is that we do reach what is, as John Kerry says, both the opportunity and responsibility of design. And he's an architect, by the way, not the comedian John Kerry. Design, he says, has a unique ability to dignify. It can make people feel valued, respected, honored, and seen. Of course, it can do the opposite as well. So as we're out there making decisions that impact another and designing our world, we have to ask ourselves, are we part of the revolution, or are we reifying and perpetuating cycles of oppression and exclusion? Are we changing them? As designers, we also have to contend with the fact that power asymmetries, racial dynamics, mental health considerations, and other challenges are often neglected by designers. So we codify these into our spaces without even necessarily being aware of it. A couple of examples I'll give you. This is a tweet that was just sent out. US has the resources to feed, house, and provide free health care for everyone, chooses not to. And that was in response to breaking news from the USDA that they were going to have free lunches for all students through 2021 and 22. Student debt and school meal debt has been a big topic for the last number of years. The unpaid meal debt has topped $10 million, and advocates have been pushing for a long time for this to happen, for the US to have free lunch. Students have been shamed over not being able to pay for their lunches. They've had lunches taken away from kids. They've had schools depending on charities and bake sales to try to raise money for this. So this is an example of people who are in a position to make decisions, not making those decisions, and then choosing to make them. And this is a humanizing time. This is another tweet that went out from Better Allies. And this was an article that said that Black employees might feel more stressed this week because of the trial of Derek Chauvin. And it was coming to a close. That meant that a verdict was coming soon. So it suggested to managers that they set an alert so that they're aware when there is a verdict. So that raises the question, who's informed about these things, who's paying attention to them, and who has the luxury to not pay attention to them? So be proactive, they said, and send a message to your team. Create a space for people to talk post-verdict. Check in with Black colleagues. And what I appreciated about this is it said very specifically, check in with those Black colleagues that you have trusted, friendly relationships with. Don't check in with a colleague because they happen to be a person of color. That's tokenizing. And then recognize that this is a single effort. This is my add to the article within hundreds of years of systemic racism. This is cold comfort at a time when, for the last year plus, in addition to the pandemic and the burnout that's come from nonstop Zoom days back to back to back, you also have the experience of the racial disparities, the riots, the killings, etc., and the weight that has caused for some people in the workspace. This is a time for humanizing. I am lucky enough to have a boss who is, I would say, woke AF. So my family, my toddler, my time is the sort of thing that can be interrupted. There is this notion that there is a lot of life going on right now. There are a lot of complexities, and we're all doing the best we can. And as Jutta mentioned, that open office space, we're not likely to go back to it. This article was just published April 19th in Fast Company. Says the actual office workers using open offices, the experience has been less than ideal. They say they're noisy, they lack privacy, they reinforce sexist behavior, and they even make people quit their jobs. What they say in this article is what we at the IDRC have been saying for years. Here's a quote from a person in the article speaking on behalf of this. We strongly believe that the one-size-fits-all office cannot exist in the future of work, with even stronger reasons now than there were pre-pandemic. I would argue that the reasons were strong pre-pandemic as well. A homogeneous solution doesn't address the variety, the wide range of needs that each employee has. You end up with an incredibly flawed workplace strategy and an incredibly flawed workplace. And we see this with organizations. The way that you organize yourself internally manifests itself externally in products and in presence. So this is where we spend a lot of time with organizations, helping them see that the ways that you encourage creativity, freedom of thought, is by loosening up on some of these things and understanding that people are not the same and don't have all the same needs. So one of the ways to do this, as Jutta said, is focus on those outliers. Think of the edge. Can you let the individual decide? This is that one size fits one rather than the one size fits all. Let me be me. I'm the best at doing it. And think about design decisions. And instead of thinking that they're brilliant, ask, who did I just exclude? And have a pit in your stomach about having made a decision. You know, why is it that people can only take Fridays to work from home? Why was that something that we tolerated pre-pandemic? So your work begins now, and we can do so much better. We can do better in the ways that we're making decisions. We can change the ways that we are making policies. We can change our perspective. We can change what we measure, therefore the things that we value. Build trust and build diverse teams to do these things. In doing that, break down the cycles of exclusion, give a damn what's going on, and see well beyond ourselves and our own perspectives. So Jutta, do you have any thoughts? Oh, let me stop sharing the screen. To add to that, I would imagine you do.
Thank you. I think it would be great to now go to any questions that people have. And what I'd love to do is to also gather your thoughts with respect to the spectrum of work that we've talked about. And so the engineered or the organic, the workplace with choices that recognizes that we don't need a one-size-fits-all workplace, but a one-size-fits-one workplace. The ability for adaptability or the constraints that keep us in as cogs within a particular machine. I would love it if people in the audience could give us some sense of what your area of expertise and background is, and what are some of the things you'd like to learn about inclusive design or the implementation of inclusive design. We're going to provide a set of resources to learn more about what to do or how to implement in the short term and in the long term our inclusive methods. So could I invite the members of the audience to find the chat and to tell us what your background is, what your role is, and perhaps what flexibility you have in making the decisions that Jess talked about.
So far, I have disability case management
Specialist,
okay. Employment counselor, HR consultant, program assistant.
And then if people could also perhaps tell us some of the biggest challenges that you're experiencing, given that many of you are in a position of needing to respond to the needs of people with disabilities, it would be great to consider your position as well within the work hierarchy. One of the things that we find quite frequently is that the issue of the ethical questions or the ensuring that people with disabilities are included and are able to participate in work is relegated to a single department and often a single person. And that it does not bode very well for the resilience or the sustainability of many of the changes that are needed. And it relegates the responsibility to you, and it relegates the need to solve the problem to the employees with disabilities. And if there are, if you have any comments to that, that would be great as well. Okay, great. So they're coming through. I'm an information professional. My role is identifying research and resources that support the work we do. I don't necessarily have much power in decision making, but I'm able to highlight considerations we should take as we develop as an organization. So one of the things that we frequently talk about within inclusive design is the issue of research and evidence and what is impact. And the constrained notion of impact and evidence and research that is used within work. If you look at standard research methods, which are quantitative, and especially at artificial intelligence, which automates, amplifies, and accelerates many of the trends and certainly many of the findings that were previously there, what you find is that people with disabilities, small minorities and outliers are excluded. And as I was saying in that starburst, whatever evidence you are finding for a population is wrong for someone that is an outlier or is a small minority, because what it does is it reverts to the mean. It makes an assumption that truth is any truth for the average or for that majority group. And so the constraint that many people find that need to find evidence or support specific impact for a small minority or an outlying group is that the means or what is allowed in terms of how you're supposed to find the evidence, how you're supposed to find research to support it, or how you're supposed to demonstrate impact are actually a mismatch for your role. It sets up an impossible scenario because you're never going to, the diversity of the individuals with disabilities within the organization, the range and difference of the way that someone performs their job, the impact of any measure that you make to help someone or to make it more accessible for someone with a disability is so diverse and so diffuse and impacted by such complex environments that you're not going to be able to show that evidence, show that impact, or show the research results that support the types of measures that you know are really going to be impactful or that are actually going to affect change. And so one of the things, we have the 3 dimensions of inclusive design, where the first dimension is recognize that everybody's diverse and different, and that the experts in that diversity are the people themselves. And then secondly, it's create a diverse, or create an inclusive process. Nothing about us without us. Include as many diverse perspectives as possible. Bring people in at the beginning to design the decision table, not to invite them to a table that doesn't work for them. And then the third one is that we exist within a complex adaptive system, and any design decision or any step forward needs to consider that complex adaptive system, or you'll find these friction points that will make it very difficult for whatever change you've created to survive. So consider all of the nested contexts of the decision that you're making, and look at how they also need to change. It also teaches us about both vicious and virtuous cycles. A tiny, small success in one area can create a viral process that changes many other areas as well, if that's done strategically and with an understanding of from diverse perspectives. And I see there that I'm a manager, and I'm encouraged to make decisions and make mistakes, which open doors for me to learn a bit. And also constitute a lot of pressure. Well, it's wonderful that, I mean, a job environment that encourages risks and encourages you to make mistakes and learn from mistakes is a job environment that is much more flexible and adaptive, and therefore much more resilient, and able to address the unexpected. One of the things that we frequently say about the IDRC, we've been in operation for 28 years, and the highest qualification we give is we've had 28 years to learn from mistakes and failure. And that, I think, has led to our continued survival.
But that comes with a culture of understanding that mistakes and failure are some of the places where you learn the most, and you can, if you have the support to explore and to be creative, you can do something different. I just would add to what you're saying, Jutta, that one of the things that might be meaningful to somebody who's in a position to make changes is that innovation doesn't come from doing the same thing, just doing more of it with greater intensity. It comes from fundamentally changing what you're doing. And that's where we see a lot of organizations are interested in inclusive design, aren't quite sure what it means to embed it in everything that they do, but might have somebody within an HR group or a group within HR doing some of this work. And what we like to do is help them level up, so help them understand how to incorporate it in, so that it's inextricable from everything, as granular as how meetings are scheduled and structured and carried out, to how decisions are made and what it looks like to do that.
Yeah, and related to that, or not quite related, but one of the things that we're very worried about at the moment is the implementation of artificial intelligence tools or automated decision tools. And many employees don't recognize just how much that is happening, how much artificial intelligence or machine learning is making essential decisions. And those automated systems are simply amplifying, accelerating, and optimizing towards previous patterns. We talk about AI as this highly innovative thing, but in fact, it's just automating and amplifying the past, because it's depending upon data, and data is from the past. So it's looking at what worked in the past and then just making more of what worked in the past.
Which is why it's so difficult to take a look at data from the past to think about the future of work. When we talk about this, I find, Jutta, that a lot of people agree with it and then feel uneasy because they don't know what the methods look like to do this differently. But there are ways of doing this differently, I would say. So triangulation of data would get you somewhat toward something more complex where you're doing qualitative, quantitative, and anecdotal, and you understand that that anecdotal is not the sort of thing that disqualifies your data. It actually catches data that might slip through from the qualitative and quantitative perspective. And then taking a look at like Laurel Robertson's work around crystallization, where you basically only understand something partially. You only partially can know it ever. And that it takes this sort of multi-perspectival, different epistemologies, different ways of living and knowing to really get at the depths of this. And I think that you see parts and pieces of the world and different disciplines adapting and adopting some of this thinking. So the trend was to do data-driven decisions, but I've started to hear now that it's data-informed decisions. So it's not this relinquishing of all of your responsibility and decision-making to the disembodied data, which I think should make feminists very uneasy, as well as pretty much everyone else. But it's looking at data and then still making decisions that are contextualized in that moment in time.
Yeah, and to escape from that data from the past, because even just being informed by the data can be very misleading, and it doesn't offer the options that the what could be and where do we in fact want to go. So the synthetic data and imaginaries and thinking about where do we want those as-ifs, and if we're talking about ethics, Vajna and the as-if philosophy, where we're not just basing it on evidence from the past, but also doing things as if that we have reached our destination and acting
as if we can give free lunches to every school child, which we can.
Exactly.
Thank you so much, Jutta and Jess, for sharing your expertise with us and for this a very compelling conversation as well. If you don't mind, we'll move on to the Q&A session, and please feel free to jump in. So the first question is for employers who are looking to improve their inclusive design workplace model, it can be hard to assess what changes need to be made. So do you have any recommendations on ways to make these types of assessments?
Yeah, so one of the things that we often go to is you consult the individuals that have the greatest difficulty or can't use your current system. So don't go to the complacent workers who are in the middle, who are quite comfortable with the status quo. Go and ask the employees, or who you may not, or the non-employees, the people who didn't get into your place of work, or the employees that are having difficulty with the way that you've designed the environment at the moment. They're the ones that are going to give you the most insightful information. And if you address their issues, then you're going to make it even more flexible and better for those individuals that are doing quite well. One of the other rationales for that is if we take people with disabilities, they are working under specific constraints that make it more difficult to adapt to a range of things. So what we need to, but they are also individuals that have lived experience of being highly resourceful. They're not in a lived experience where they can assume that everything is working well. They move through the day and through their lives all without that comfort and assumption that things are, whether it's transportation or getting into a place or being able to read the content that is being communicated by the team, the instructions, everything has the potential to have some type of barrier. And so those individuals have to, in order to survive, be highly innovative, highly resourceful, and will provide you with many more insights.
Let's say that the getting of that information from people who are experiencing barriers should be accompanied by an effort to build trust and to build a transparent commitment to making changes. Asking people to make themselves vulnerable when they're already usually in a precarious position, and then asking them for feedback and not doing the feed forward work of it, of making changes based on that feedback, is potentially doing the same harm, and asking for the same labor that is then nothing changes. So I've seen organizations that come in to do assessments about these sorts of things and say that they won't do anything in terms of addressing the issues after the assessment for a certain period of time. And the reason they do that is because it takes that time to create these communities of care and support within an organization so that you don't have this us and them dynamic where you've got somebody picked out to represent all people who experience barriers because they are somebody who experiences a barrier, but you create this practice. As I said, it's like practicing law and practicing medicine. You create a practice of getting feedback and then feeding it forward into changes in practice, in process within the organization.
And it doesn't mean having already made a decision and then consulting them with a predetermined decision as well, which is often and it certainly doesn't mean the type of research that frequently goes on where the assumption is that you're an objective observer and they're a passive subject. It's true co-design right from the beginning, not inviting them to a decision process that isn't accessible to them either.
Yeah, and true co-design means breaking down these dynamics of power and who's a decider, and yeah.
Thank you so much. And in this specific case, I thank you for bringing up the concept of full equity. In the example you mentioned, Jutta, where employees living with disabilities didn't help shape a work environment, and so the decisions are already made. What do you recommend for employers to do to make their work environment more inclusive and take in account that feedback from the new employee that is living with a disability?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So the example I was thinking of, and there's many more examples, is the federal government has had a commitment to hire a certain number, and in this case it's 5,000. But the issue with that is that there are more people leaving than being hired with disabilities. And the reason for that is that when they arrive at the workplace, it's not necessarily very concrete what happens, but everybody within the team is highly enthusiastic initially, and they try their best to make sure that the person is included and feels welcome, and they have the necessary tools that they need. But the effort then slowly starts to be more than the team can handle. Because the tools there are in and of themselves inaccessible, and they don't support accessible communication or things of that nature, which then slowly but surely the person starts to feel left out. Say it's someone who's blind, and the mode of communication is something that doesn't work with a screen reader, and their co-workers have to do something special in order for the person to participate. So that's what I meant by setting up not just the person, but also the team for failure. What needs to happen is, in the process of recruiting or bringing somebody on board, you also need to recruit them to help redesign the workplace in general. You can't just, and the same goes for anyone who has previously not been there, whether it's a BIPOC employee and they're, the workers go to a club that is far from the neighborhood of most of the BIPOC recruits, or whether, you see that again and again. So when you're taking on the goal of bringing on more diverse individuals into your workforce, you have to think about all of the ways in which you've designed the work environment in such a way that it's biased against the people that you're bringing into the work environment. And Jess, you probably have things to add.
Yeah, I was going to say that some of that is not understanding the assumptions that go into our own failure of imagination. If somebody comes into a workplace and has the same tools we have, has a screen reader, we think, oh, everything's just supposed to be the same, or screen magnifier. That's actually not the case. And this is where understanding that having different tools doesn't mean you all are going to have the exact same access still. These tools are built with 2D linearization assumptions. They're built around the dominant assumptions of being visual and retaining information at a glance. And these aren't assumptions that we can make about everybody. And I think that some of the pitfalls come from not understanding the different ways that somebody can make sense of this. So I can't think about something in the same way that somebody who's trained themselves to retain information, because they can't see the information in an infographic can. And that is a difference that it could benefit many people. It benefits me to learn different ways of doing that. And it would benefit the communication of the information altogether. Yeah, I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten it.
We can, if it comes up, Jess, please let us know. Another question, actually, Jess, you talked about what is fair and what can employers do to ensure that their inclusive workplace model is fair to all employees during the pandemic and continue to keep it this way so how do they make it fair? I think you've started that conversation already, but what are the steps? What are your recommendations? What is the thinking process as well behind it?
I think you start with questioning everything. I have a colleague who goes through a syllabus or a policy or anything he's written and adds "because I said so" to the end of every sentence. And if it sounds like the sort of paternalistic decision making for somebody changes the way that it's structured, why should we tell people where to work, how to work, and when to work? Isn't it better if we let them choose those things and have the ability to do the work when it's going to be the best situation or time for them? They could have constraints or barriers to doing good work between the hours of 9 and 3. Maybe their kids are at home. And so I think it's asking some of those questions, and it's also fundamentally being more self-aware. So one of the things that I think we used to see a lot of is we used to do a ton of traveling and a ton of talking in person. We'd go to conferences, you know, who was that available to and who wasn't it available to? When I go to conferences now, and as I mentioned, there are hundreds of people showing up from all over the world, it really, I think, is dawning on people that they're going to have, at the very least, a hybrid moving forward. They're going to have remote participation and local participation, and they're going to figure out ways to make the folks who are remote feel a part of the event. And we see things like that in workplaces where you go out for beers afterwards, or as Jutta was talking about, you know, you go, I don't know who's going to a club. I don't think they should. I don't think you should go out for beers either. I don't know about all of this partying. But you know, so who has to go home early because the bus that takes them home goes through an area that they know is dangerous for them, and they're a woman on public transportation. You know, this taps into the inequities that we already have socially and we know exist. So who can go out for beers after work and have some conversations? It's not the people with children or dependents at home, or even a dog at home. You have to go home and take the dog out, right? So who is excluded from these moments where decisions or work gets discussed and relationships get built? I think we have to be more critical of ourselves and our own behavior and what we're doing, to think about who can be there and who can't be there. And the way I think about it is asking the opposite. Instead of, you know, who does this work for? Who doesn't this work for? Who did I just break this for? You know, what does it mean to make a decision at beers after work? And that doesn't preclude, you know, building a nice friendship or relationship with coworkers, but it does mean being aware of what you're doing in that space and time. I don't know, Jutta, what do you think? You go to clubs?
No. But yeah, I mean, that I think you've answered it well.
One of the questions you said that might guide the decision making is, am I a revolutionary? Is that a revolutionary decision, or am I perpetuating another cycle of oppression? What are other questions designers need to ask themselves to help them make that decision?
I think that with this brilliant design decision, what did I just break? Who did I just screw this up for? Instead of brilliance, I'd like people who are in design positions or leadership positions where they're making decisions about something for somebody else, which I think is design. I'd rather they ask, who did I just break this for, and have a pit in their stomach about having broken it, rather than the self-satisfied, this was brilliant, this design decision was brilliant.
Who's still missing? Who am I missing? Yeah. That frequently that question cannot be answered by the group. That, I mean, it's a question that is iterative, because the original decision makers often don't have the information about who is still missing.
Oh, and the thought that ran away came back and is relevant here, and that is the point that you made earlier, Jutta, about inviting somebody to the table. And this is one of the tropes of DEI, is you've got to be invited to the table. The problem is that, as you said, the table's already been built. It's already been constructed. The mores, the culture, it's already there. There's the person who's the highest paid person at the table. There's the person who's the loudest person, and then there's the person who's expected to take the notes. You know, there are all of these cultural things that we've embedded into the table. So rather than inviting somebody to the table and setting them up for failure, what does it look like to co-create that space, to co-create, maybe it's not a table at all, maybe it's a circle, right?
Those are great points. Thank you so much. Following that thought, I think it has been mentioned that when making difficult decisions in the workplace, sometimes employers say the reason is because research shows this is the best way, or the majority do it this way. How do you think this impacts the minorities, and how do you suggest they challenge such reasoning in the workplace?
Yeah, everything that is revealed by research is wrong for the outliers or the minorities. It either is, it doesn't apply very well, or it's wrong. And that extends to almost every form of research. If you're using population data, and there I mean the population of the entire employees, if you use what is favored research, which is whether it's CRT or anything statistical, what you're doing is you're revealing what the mean or the majority, what works for the majority or for the mean. And by
There's our revolution.
By extension, it means that it's wrong for anyone who's an outlier or a small minority. So what do we need to do? We need to do non-parametric. And so if you're a researcher, the other problem with standard research is you've already predetermined what the parameters are going to be. So that prevents you from discovering new parameters. Every survey, you've already asked, I mean, every survey that doesn't have things like an open text field, every constraint you put on what you discover through research is going to exclude someone. So what you need to do is to start bottom-up research where it's non-parametric, where people have the flexibility to respond in the way that that applies to their way of living. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is supporting storytelling, have people tell the stories of their lived experience. And as Jess said, that's the first part of that is building the trust. Yes, we want anecdotal evidence, because quite frequently what you find, especially with disability, is that the n equals 1. There's no one else. There's no opportunity or notion of representation. There is not going to be another person that represents the requirements and the lived experience of that person. So every quantitative analytics or every statistical analytics is going to compromise that position. So yeah, non-parametric, bottom-up, anecdotal, and looking at, as opposed to, I mean, all research is also removing diversity and removing complexity, because we as people, human minds have difficulty with diversity and complexity. And what we need to do is we need to look at the spectrum of answers, or the range of requirements, as opposed to the most popular or the most, the highest incidence, or the average or the majority. And it goes beyond just research. We are so wedded to best practice, the winning solution, the priority areas, all of which mean that there is sort of this single view, as opposed to a plurality and a spectrum, a series of choices. And within every other field, we understand the importance of diversification, whether it's biology or whether it's economics, or that we know that we need to diversify the market. We know that a diversity of species is a good thing. And this gets into my, I mean, even within the pandemic, we've taken such a wrong turn, because we've actually resorted in some cases to social Darwinism. We've talked about the people that have the greatest chance of living being the ones that should get that should receive the priority within a triage situation. And we misinterpret Darwin, and we think it's a survival of the fittest, that life is a winner takes all, zero-sum game. But in fact, the fuel of evolution is diversity. And the expansion of evolutionary choices. And when we have relaxed selection, that's when in evolutionary history, we had most of the advances within our human field. And when we think about who is the fittest, in fact, it's not the strong, it's the or the complacent. It's not those with wealth and power. It's the individuals that have to adapt. So we need vulnerability and fragility to survive. It compels us to create a system that will work for us when we are vulnerable. So research is going in a completely wrong direction. We really need to rethink research. And this is me as an academic talking. I understand the awesome responsibility that academia has and researchers have. We've done it all wrong. And we need to highlight what is the spectrum of needs, what is the range of needs, how wide is the number of things that we need to reveal, and then also how far away are the individuals who are at the outlying parts of that spectrum from the fairness or the equity that we're hoping to achieve.
I'll give you a mundane example of this thinking and how it's invaded everything. A popular tool nowadays, now that we're all on web and video conferencing, is using Slido. And one of the things that Slido advertises is the ability for people to vote anonymously for the questions they like, bringing the most important topics to light. We've made this leap from popularity to importance, and we haven't questioned it at all. We let the machine do it, and then we just follow. And that, I think, is something.
Yeah, we've created a Wordle, or a word cloud, where we've reversed that, because the other thing that people don't seem to realize is by doing that popularity, where the majority topics are centered, which of course means they have more attention and grow in size. So when you reverse then you're more likely to find the unique and innovative systems or answers, responses, questions, whatever, and rather than having the outlying or minority topics disappear.
Thank you so much, both of you. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but those are important conversations. And thank you for this new perspective to look at things, and it really makes us think. Thank you for this great Q&A session. And a few reminders an announcement to our audience. This presentation is recorded and will be posted for free on our website along with the slides. It will also be available as a free webinar course in our WWI eCampus. If you're a WWI, VRA Canada, or CPHR Alberta member, you receive free certificates of attendance. Our next webinar is COVID-19, Stress and the Mental Health Pandemic, presented by Rogers S. McIntyre, Professor of Psychiatry and Pharmacology at the University of Toronto and head of the Mood Disorders Psychopharmacology Unit at the University Health Network in Toronto. It will be held on Tuesday, April 27th at 11 a.m. Pacific Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Immediately following the webinar session, you will be directed to the evaluation survey. We greatly appreciate your input on our webinars as well as suggestions for future topic areas. All of our webinars are created for public access and supported by memberships and funding sponsors. Thank you again to our audience for your participation, and to our experts, panelists, Jutta Treviranus and Jess Mitchell. Thank you immensely for your time and your expertise. Thank you so much. Goodbye.